this email? What does it mean?
Communication is the imparting or exchanging of information or news.
The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place.
Conversation is the oral exchange of sentiments, observations, opinions, or ideas.
Forbes Books Radio presents The Conversation with Clinton M. Padgett.
Welcome back to part 2 of my conversation with David Hutchens, the storytelling leader and author of the upcoming book, Story Sprint. Find, develop, and activate your most important business stories in just a few hours. We pick back up discussing the 3 stories that leaders should be telling in a time of uncertainty. So, what are these 3 stories I'm always hearing you talk about?
It's funny. I've got 3 stories. I've got another construct that says there's 4 stories. The story deck says that there's 27 stories. I think that there's probably about 1 million stories.
It's all fluid.
Yes. But as you and I are recording this conversation, we are in this COVID experience right now in 2020. And we're all in uncertainty. And so there's a message that I've been sharing with a few groups that's kind of gotten some attention that says, in a time of uncertainty, there are 3 stories that leaders should be telling in order to move the organization or the system forward. And this comes from a body of theory known as appreciative inquiry, a guy named Dr. David Cooper-Ryder out of Case Western. And appreciative inquiry says that all organizational systems have 3 basic needs. And this is true in your company, this is true in your team, this is true in your family. And the 3 basic needs are for continuity, novelty, and transition. And so continuity, the leader is managing, this is the stuff that doesn't change. Identity, values, founding principles. And then novelty is the need for the new. Organizations thrive on the new. Leadership, looks to the future. We're always focused on the new. And so we need to be bringing in the new as well. And then the transition is all of those process stories. That's managing journey. As we're learning, we're trying new things, we're implementing, we're executing, we're failing, we're trying again, we're adopting new behaviors, we're moving towards this better future. And so what I'm saying is there are stories that bring all 3 of those to life, not just that we manage those needs, but that we tell stories about each of those. And so continuity. One story type there is the origin story, the thing that was true at the beginning, right?
Right.
I have some examples of those. And then there's the novelty story. Those tend to sound like imagine a world or the thing we don't have here. I was just talking to a colleague of mine. He was a friend of mine from college, and he works for one of our competitors. And they're doing something different over there. And so I called Josh and I said, tell me what y'all are doing. And he said, yeah, we're getting some really interesting results here. And so this new thing they're doing over there, we don't have that here. Imagine if we did.
Right.
Think how powerful that would be. Right. So we're telling
that's
you
every commercial you ever hear. Imagine a universe where.
Yeah, movies used to do that, right? The trailers. Imagine a world. But that's powerful language because now you're not telling your team what to do. You're not saying, hey, everybody, you better embrace this new thing. It's you're telling a story that's attractive and you're putting it out there. Imagine if it looked like this. I didn't tell you what to do. I'm just saying, wouldn't that be cool? And now when you use this language, now the system moves towards that. If the future story feels better than the story that I'm in right now, and it's credible, then I say, ooh, I want that. What's the holdup? Why don't we have that here? And now you can get the system demanding the new. And so narrative language is really good at that. And then, of course, those transition stories. We should be telling these all the time. A lot of these are like learning stories. And a good litmus test of an innovation culture is, are we telling learning stories? I'm working with one group where on Friday night, everybody stays an extra hour. They give everybody beer. So stick around. And there actually is a stage, and they call it, I don't want to drop the F-bomb, but it's F-up night. And it's, oh, Clint, get up there. Tell about massive failure presentation you did, and you get up and go, oh, I don't want to. All right, here's what happened. And everyone's raising their beer. And it's a lot of fun. But what it's doing is it's normalizing and even celebrating the fact that we can tell these stories to each other. In fact, if we're going to innovate, we have to tell these stories to each other. So it's creating a culture that normalizes those. So that's one type of the transition story. So continuity, novelty, transition. And on my website and elsewhere, I've got lots of examples of what those stories can sound like.
You mentioned the third one being also about learning, and to me, they say you learn more from your failures than you do anything else. So the idea of maybe not celebrating, but at least getting up on stage and talking about a failure educates those of us around us, so we do learn from those.
Yeah, and if your kids are still young and at home and at the dinner table, I mean, especially when my kids are 20 now. 20 and 19, and I still tell these stories. They love it when daddy comes to the table and says, man, I did something really dumb today at work. I'm really embarrassed. They're like, what did you do? But what I'm doing is I'm showing them what resilience looks like, that
Sure.
Even when you get to be daddy's age, you're going to screw up. And what's that conversation in your head look like? Like, I remember when my daughter was a teenager, she was having a really hard time. And instead of advice giving or telling her what she needed to do, I told stories at the dinner table. Let me tell you about a time when I was, about your age, I screwed up really bad. And what I found is that you can land on your feet and it's going to be okay. So I was telling her resilience stories. Or I told stories about a time that no matter how bad I screwed up, I knew that I was surrounded by people who loved me. So I'm not telling her what to do. I'm just putting those stories out there. And it was amazing. She moved towards those stories. I believe those stories helped my teenager come out of a really tough time.
That's good to hear, man. Because I have a brand new teenager, so I've got all that ahead of me, and I got another one that's only 10. So I've got two of them that are. I'll be calling you offline, going, hey, what about this?
Especially for girls, this is a hard time to be a 15-year-old girl. It's a hard world.
Yeah, well, my daughter's only 10, so I've got a couple of years for it to get worse, I suppose. Now, one of the things I read, you talk about building a story bank. What's that all about?
So when I say story bank, that sounds like a technology term. There's a story bank in your mind. And when we tell stories, when we pull memories out of our heads and say, hey, I think this is worth telling somebody, and then you tell it. Now this memory, which is an amorphous thing that lived in the squishy neural folds of your brain, now that you've told it, now it's a knowledge artifact. And simply by telling it, you've turned it into this thing that holds power. And so when I go home for Thanksgiving, your family does this too. We're all sitting around the table and my brothers will say, remember that time we went to the Grand Canyon on vacation and Dad got us lost? And we all start laughing. No, that's not what happened. Here's what happened. Everyone tells their version of the story. The time we got lost at the Grand Canyon, simply telling the story and then giving a title like that. And now we don't even need to tell the whole story. We just say that. Remember that time Dad got us lost? It takes on a life, and now it's like forming the identity of the Hutchins family. Selecting a memory and then naming it that way and then telling it makes it go into this story bank. I'm using that metaphorically, but there is a story bank in your brain of memories. And when I work with teams and leaders to find the value creating stories about the work they're doing, it's a numbers game. We want lots of these stories about us at our best, or the time we delivered value and what that looks like. And the more you tell them, and the more I hear your stories, and the more you hear mine, and then we hear Joe's and we hear Janet's, now our brain is populated with these powerful narrative assets that we can bring into different kinds of conversations. So the more we stay in this work, the more we populate this story bank that lives in our brain.
I could tell you mentioned the kind of the Hutchins family stories. I know that this is really more business focused, but this is a personal side note. My brother and I had a very interesting upbringing, and we'll leave it that way. And so we still find every time we get together, we'll do, remember that time? And it's something that would probably send most people screaming from the rooms crying, we just laugh because the telling the story is therapeutic for us. It just makes it all palatable, I guess.
So ultimately, stories are about sense making. And we keep using this word storytelling. Like I said, it's a weird word. One problem with the word is that piece that's telling. It sounds like it goes one direction. A lot of the really interesting work in organizational narrative is coming from the world of knowledge management, which is dealing with what does the organization know? What is the wisdom that lives in the organization? Not data. Data you can put in an Excel spreadsheet, but wisdom, knowledge, the hard stuff that you can't put in a spreadsheet. And it turns out that story is the container for this really rich organizational information. And so the really rich application here is when you bring the team together and someone tells the story, you don't just move on. That's not the end of the conversation. Now the team becomes interpretive community. And you say, I heard something in that. That story made me think of something. That story gave me an idea. I think that story says something about who we are. So now we're in knowledge construction and meaning making. And so, Clint, when you and your brother tell the rough stories of growing up, part of it is to chase those demons away by laughing at it. But we're also constantly in sense making. And as adults, we get to change the meaning of the story. And that's called learning and growth. Right. And so a lot of the work that I do bring to organizations is how do we host this powerful conversation where we draw not just meaning, but also actionable insight out of the stories that we tell each other so that we can move the work forward.
Well, putting the business slant on this, bringing it back a little bit, I do think that one of the benefits of storytelling or having these narratives, if you want to stop using the word storytelling, but having these narratives is some of us are number people. Like I know numbers and I can remember phone numbers and credit card numbers and all these things in my head, but not all of us are like that. But almost all of us are able to remember a story we've been told. And even if we put our own little slant on it, our own interpretation or our own bias, I'm able to take that story. If there's 10 of us in the room that are in the company, we tell that story, we get that common story. We're all going to go out and tell about the same story. Whereas we might not give the same set of numbers or the same set of data. We have the same story we can communicate.
So there's this sticky aspect of story where you don't remember the data, and there's data on this.
There's data about not remembering the data.
There is. After the presentation with all your slides, we know how much the audience remembers. It's about 5%, and that's 1 hour after, depending on what kind of data it was. And then the next day, it might be a single idea. But if you tell a story, and if it's a good story, they might remember that forever. Right before COVID, I was sitting in a presentation. It was a guy who had just been through the program. So we had spent, a few days earlier telling stories the whole time. And he was in this presentation and I was just cringing because I'm going, dude, you're not telling any stories. I'm like, you didn't learn anything from our time together. He's just going one slide after another. And the thing that was wild is I was at the back of this dark auditorium and I could see the audience and people are like squirming in their seats because they're bored. People are bored by looking at data slides. And I even saw a little glow from people's laps as people were turning on their phones. So he's losing his audience. And I'm thinking, you're losing us. And then just when it almost seemed hopeless, he said, that reminds me of a time. Just a few weeks ago, I was in Germany working with a really tough customer. And that language, that's narrative language, right? It starts with a place and a time and a protagonist. Several weeks ago, I was in Germany working with a tough customer. When he said that, I saw every head in the audience lift up again and I saw the phones go off. He got us back. He stepped out of the data and started telling a story, and it reclaimed the attention of the audience. And after the presentation, that was the thing everybody wanted to talk about. Hey, so what did you say that the client in Germany? Oh, I've experienced that. Here's what I would have said. That was the hit of the presentation and nobody talked about the data. So my message to this audience is, what are the one or two things that you want your audience to take away from your message? You only get one or two things. So first get clear on what those one or two things are. And now how can you embed those ideas in a story that will stick in people's bodies so that they carry it with them? And that's the whole process of a story sprint, is getting that strategic clarity of there's something I want people to know. Now, how do I work backwards and build that into a story that makes it unforgettable?
Makes perfect sense. I want to touch on something you mentioned a minute ago with the story circle, and having, again, been a part of one of your one of your sessions. Yeah, even though I'm a people person, you start getting knee to knee, it's a little bit uncomfortable. And I was curious, how does does it still work even in other cultures? Obviously it doesn't work today because we got to be 6 feet apart plus, but even when you go other places, or with do some people say, well, I'm an SVP and that, I'm not going to get knee to knee with Clint over here because he's a new intern at the company. I mean, what is that dynamic like?
Yeah. So there's the whole vulnerability piece of this. And, I know some people who do story work and they insist that you have to get vulnerable. Clint, come into this business group and tell us about all the painful stuff that happened to you when you were a kid. You don't want to do that. That's
No.
not the place for it. And so I resist people who say you have to get vulnerable. No, that's a choice you get to make. Right. You get to decide which stories to bring. But even when the stories we tell aren't particularly personal, there is an element of narrative language that when we start telling stories, even if it's about the team or something, it still feels personally risky. There's something about narrative language that it's scary for some people, even when the stories aren't personal. And that is a feature of this.
I mean, there's a bit of intimacy when you tell personal, even in business stories, when you're telling it narratively, it still feels a bit intimate.
When that neural coupling happens, when we connect in that way, there's a human intimacy to that.
Yeah. And
I'm saying we want that moment of connection in more parts of our work, while also acknowledging this feels weird to some people. And Clint, I've done this in India. I've done this in Asia, where senior leadership and middle management, that it's very hierarchical.
Yep.
And in a way that in the Western cultures aren't. I've done this all across Europe, all across the United States, and it works in every culture. And even my French audiences that I work with that are also hierarchical are saying the conversation is changing. The way that we've been showing up in the organization that used to work doesn't work anymore. That we need to, we need to show up with more humanity. So there is power in bringing leaders from different levels of the organization and say, let's just talk to each other about what's going on. I hope that more leaders will embrace that challenge.
I think that's one of the secret sauces that we bring from what I do for a living with project management, is we force people to come into a room and have conversations and tell, you can call it telling stories, but it's about forcing us to talk to each other, forming these neural connections or these bonds we can then go remote for the rest of the project with, talking about what my piece of the project is and how it interacts with Joe's piece and Janet's piece and Joanne's piece. And that's why we think people have a better understanding of the project when they leave the room, is because they've told a story about it, as opposed, and yeah, there's data. There's going to be a nice Microsoft project file when we're all done, and we'll have all our Gantt charts to back it up. But people have a better understanding of how they need to work together, interconnect. And then we can go back across the globe and have people halfway around the world still working together remotely because of those connections we make in those planning sessions.
If you're a senior leader, why wouldn't you want that?
Right.
Why wouldn't you want those human connections with the people that you're leading, especially if you're in charge of some really important stuff? You need them to be engaged, and people don't get engaged with ideas or projects. People get engaged with other people. So you're not only responsible for the project as a leader, you're responsible for the process. It's not just this outcome, it's you. Don't show us only the project plan, show us you.
Right.
Because that's what's going to move the work forward in the organization.
It's particularly, I think, important in a matrix world that most of us live in, where that project manager doesn't give me my pay raises or my job reviews. That's my functional manager. So if you're a project manager in that environment, you need the people to hold themselves accountable. right? And that's only you have a much higher probability of success if people are holding themselves accountable through storytelling and through narrative.
And story is how you influence and how you spread your own leadership. Yeah, I can't influence the guy above me. He's my boss. But if I tell stories, that can be a powerful way to influence him. Or in a matrixed environment, if I want people to know the value that I've been bringing, story might be the better language to use.
Right. So, David, what is the ROI behind storytelling? What's in it for us?
What is the ROI of storytelling? So the technology consulting firm that I was telling you about, I went into work with a team. This was in Boston, and they were going into an RFP for a huge healthcare organization. They're going to do the technology back end for this massive healthcare system, $250 million piece of work. And this was the client who said, listen, we're talking to 3 of your competitors. And this was the client that said, please don't bore us, because a project like this, the sales conversation is 8 hours long. And then we're talking to your competitor for 8 hours tomorrow. And they're human too. They're like, just don't bore us. And so these were all technology geniuses putting together the presentation. And this language of show us who you are and make us believe, that they were stunted by that. What does that even mean? What does that language mean? We've always won by selling solutions. Make you believe in us? And so that's why they called me. They said, we think maybe stories has something to do with this. And I said, I think so too. So I spent a couple days, they had the war room where they were putting together the presentation. They had like 12 people, and they were, ordering in pizza and staying till 11 o'clock at night. And because this was the pitch of their careers. And I worked with them to find the stories that would amplify their messages, that would create this belief connection. And they won the account. And they didn't, they have not said it's because of David Hutchens that we made $250 million. But because their pitch was brilliant and the solution was brilliant. But they did say the stories we told were instrumental in creating this more important human connection that this client was demanding. So in answer to your question, what's the ROI? I've got one group that says the ROI could be $250 million.
First of all, congratulations. I hope you worked on a commission basis on that one.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I flubbed that one.
But in all seriousness, what I loved about that story was we started off with, we're in the war room, right? And that's like the obligatory, we're all in a war room, and we're going to war against our competitors to get this business. And yet what got in the business was, tell us who you are. I mean, wow, what a transformation between those two. And everybody's going to war. We're just going to tell you who we are. And who got the business? The personal level.
I love that, Clint. When we talk about the sense-making piece, you're doing it right now. I tell a story and you say, I heard something in that. And the transition from war room to peacemaking is a lens that had never occurred to me. And that is what a fantastic interpretation. I think you're right, Clint. That did happen. I saw that shift happen in this team as they moved from needing to conquer to needing to connect. I love
Awesome.
that.
Yeah. Feel free to use that.
That's great. I'm going to. That'll go in the next book.
All right. No problem.
I'll buy
Kickbacks
you
accepted.
You get a beer. Yeah.
All right. As we bring this thing to a close, a couple more questions for you. So what advice do you have for folks that are just trying to get started to do this?
If you're just trying to get started, tell a story. You already know how to do this. If you did not hire a story consultant to come in and support you, I think you already know what to do. Tell us what happened and tell us why it mattered. It's funny. I'm part of a board of directors of a nonprofit organization here in my town of Nashville, Tennessee. It's this group that helps women come out of sex trafficking, and then they go into they learn leadership skills, and now they're running a $2 million organization. It's this beautiful company, and when I go to the board meetings, they're so left-brained because everyone just puts up a PowerPoint and says, "Here's our strategic objectives, and then here's the financials," and I'm like, these are the worst meetings for the most beautiful organization. And then when it's my time to present, I say, let me show you about a meeting I had with some of the survivor leaders. And here's a photo. And here's what we learned. And here's a picture of us all hugging at the end because it was such a powerful connection that we had. And after this board meeting, everyone comes up and says, Dave, yours was the best presentation, and we want to be on your task force because yours is the most inspirational one. I go, no, it's not. All I did that was different was I described what happened, and you didn't do that. You showed us slides. And if in the next meeting, if you would step forward and say, here's what's happening in the housing residential task force. Here's what's happening in the recovery task force. Tell us your stories, engage us. And it's the craziest thing that people forget to do this. They forget to bring this language that is narrative, where you describe something that mattered to you. So how do you get started? Tell a story. It's that simple.
Yeah, I think if I was going to try to do this, if I didn't have good storytelling skills and I wanted to bring this into my organization and try to do this in the business sense, I'd probably sit down even by myself and just think of a story that I'm comfortable telling. It's personal, and just kind of tell that story out loud and see if I can learn from that, and then tell it to somebody I'm close to that I'm not afraid of getting, negative feedback from. And then eventually hopefully be able to tell that story. That's a business related story. So to me, it's about not being afraid to start.
Beautiful. I couldn't have said it better.
If we all wait to be perfect, we'll never start. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. You have to be willing to fumble at the beginning. That's called growing and learning. One of the resources that I use when I work with people, I have a visual framework that you probably remember called the story canvas. And you can take a story you want to tell and build it visually on this framework, and then try telling it and see if it sounds different. And one of the important, it's little boxes that you fill in with sticky notes. And one of the important boxes at the end is a box called, and now we know. There's a reason I told you this story. And when I work with leaders and we're developing our narrative assets, this is actually the box I spend the most time on, is I think this story says something. There's something I want you to believe or feel or do because I've told you this story. And it's getting really clear on that outcome. So this is the strategic piece. What is it you want to happen from telling this story? You got it. What's the next step? You ask, what's the first thing to do? This would be the second thing to do, is get that clarity on why am I telling this story? What do I want to happen? And once I know that, that's going to affect how I tell that story. Now I know which elements need to go in to get to that outcome. And this is where a book like Story Sprint, coming out spring 2021, might be helpful.
Exactly. So before we tie everything together with a nice bow, any last words of wisdom or inspiration you want to give the listeners?
Last words of wisdom are subscribe to Clint Padgett's podcast and listen to everything this man has to say, because he is a lovely human being.
I appreciate that. All right. Well, David, it's been great catching up with you as always, my friend. I hope next time it will be over that beer at your place in Nashville. And then if people want to get in touch with you or learn how to engage, buy your services, or even get your books, how can they do that?
So I hope you'll put both my website and my email address. You're welcome to put my email address in your notes for the podcast. Come to my website, storytellingleader.com, storytellingleader.com. And my email address is david@davidhutchens.com. And you got to spell Hutchins correctly with an E-N-S, not an I-N-S. It'll be in the show notes. But let me know how I can support you.
Awesome. Thanks for the conversation, David.
Always a pleasure. Thanks, Clint.
Thanks for listening to The Conversation with Clinton M. Padgett. To find out more about Clint, go to projectsuccess.com or pick up Clint's book, The Project Success Method, at amazon.com. This has been a production of Forbes Books Radio.